It was in front of this entrance to Haden Hill Park that, on Saturday, the 21st of October 1922, Mr. John Shaw said, "I have much pleasure in declaring the park open to the public for their use forever." Later that day, 5,000 residents of Rowley Regis and the local area strolled around their park for the first time. And it was their park because the £8,500 required to purchase it was raised by public subscription. Haden Hill Park is located in Old Hill in the Metropolitan Borough of Sandwell. The 28th of April 2004, it received the Green Flag Award, and it has received this award in all the years since then. It's the first park in Sandwell to be given a green flag. Between the years 2000 and 2008, a Heritage Lottery Fund grant of over £2 million enabled the park to have, in modern parlance, a makeover. Of course, it was not always a park. A map of 1821 shows the old hall with its dovecot surrounded by farmland. Indeed, on the farmland were 3 cottages on or near the former Haysich Common. In 1877, Mr. George Alfred Haden Best inherited the Haden Bars estates and built himself a grand house, which was completed in 1878. At the same time, he converted about 35 acres of the estate into a private park. The old hall, the ancestral home of the Haden family, was left standing and was lived in by his aunt, Mary Bars. When he died in 1921, a public fund was opened, and this raised £10,779. This was used to purchase the estate and some surrounding land. The deeds for this land were given to Rowley Regis Urban District Council on the 14th of October 1922, and a week later, on the 21st of October, the public opening of the park took place. It was attended by 5,000 people. Thus, the landscape features of the park belong to one or more of 3 periods of time. Firstly, the period before 1877, when the land beyond the hall and its gardens was farmland. Secondly, the period 1878 to 1921, when Mr. Best converted it into a private park. And finally, the period from 1922 onwards, when the public park was under the control of the local council. In Mr. Best's day, the area behind me is where he sited his glass houses. But in the days of the public park, there was a bowling green there. In the recent makeover, it's been converted into a public car park. Quite clearly, we're standing on a bowling green, but in the 1940s and 50s, this was the site of a putting green. This pond is marked on the 1821 map, but when Mr. Best landscaped his grounds, he shaped it a little bit differently and also put in that fountain. However, the fountain has been renovated several times since. The rainwater falling on the house is channeled into the pond to top it up. This is particularly important in the summer. On the west side of the pond, as a result of the 2000 to 2008 makeover, there is a feeding platform. In the days of the hall, this was part of the private gardens, but Mr. Best converted it into tennis courts. Later on, when it became a public park, it was converted into a bowling green. Behind me is the old hall, which was built mainly in the 1500s and 1600s. It was the ancestral home of the Haden family and was lived in until 1921. This is the remains of a medieval wayside cross, which was probably located at the top of Station Road, Old Hill, on the old road between Dudley and Halesowen. Later, it was moved to a position in the middle of the road, somewhere near the top of Haden Hill and Haysich Road. Since then, it has had 2 more moves until finally resting here in 1937, about 30 yards in front of the studded door of the old hall. The space behind me is where there used to be a swimming pool. It was opened on the 10th of July 1926. It was outdoor and unheated. It finally closed after the long school summer holidays in 1966. This wall behind me dates back to the time when the land we are standing on was farmland. In order to prevent the cattle from encroaching onto the gardens of the hall, this wall was built. It is called a ha-ha. The ha-ha was demolished in the 1980s to make it easier to mow the lawn. But during the renovation of the early 2000s, it was rebuilt with recycled sandstone. The garden behind me was originally part of the gardens belonging to the old hall. Today, the Parks Department work very hard on them. They are now taking out the winter bedding polyanthers, and next week we'll be putting in the summer bedding plants. Only part of this land, to the north of the main drive to the old hall, was in Mr. Best's private park. But when it was opened as a public park in 1922, the council purchased some land which had formerly been part of Temple Meadow Field. Here they laid out tennis courts. In the recent makeover, a multi-purpose court has been put in and a circular performance area at the top end of the piece of land with a gazebo as a shelter. On the public part of Temple Meadow Field, in 1938, the municipal buildings were built, and in 1976, the leisure centre in Bars Road. Recently, the municipal buildings have been demolished, and in their place is the fire station called Haden Cross Fire Station. At the back of me is Mr. Best's lodge. This, of course, was built in 1878, the same time as the house. Here, a lodge keeper would have monitored the comings and goings of Mr. Best's visitors. In 1980, the Right to Buy Council House Act was passed, and on the back of this, in 1987, the tenant bought the property. Mr. Best didn't want his visitors to use the old drive, which went straight to the Tudor Hall, because the aspect from it was a northerly one, and their view, therefore, was over the coal mines, brickworks and ironworks of the Black Country, all smothered in a blanket of smoke. Instead, he put in a southern loop, so his visitors would have views over the Worcestershire countryside, which rose to the twin peaks of Clent and Walton. In the late 1990s, John Crumpton, who at that time was the keeper of the Black Country Museum, drew a map showing the limits of the Black Country. For that purpose, he used the first and second editions of the Ordnance Survey maps on a scale of 1 to 2,500. His southern border of the Black Country more or less ran up this drive. To the north was the Black Country, and to the south was its green borderland. The serpent benches, and by serpent benches I mean the cast iron part of them is designed like a serpent, are based upon an old photograph of about 1900 and show benches like this, which obviously belonged to Mr. Best. This is part of the southerly drive which loops round to the south side of Mr. Best's house. The view from it is absolutely magnificent, and on the skyline you will see both Clent and Walton Hills. On the 28th of October 1937, a Sons of Rest was opened on the land behind me. It was built on very steeply sloping land and was supported by pillars on the downslope side. On the 7th of April 2000, there was an arson attack which resulted in the destruction of the building. This walk is known as the Rhododendron Walk, but unofficially it is referred to as the Pets Graves Walk. On the right here was a dog's grave. It was a Dalmatian which was reputedly killed under the wheels of a coach. It was surmounted by a superstructure, but nothing is actually left of that. This grave is the final resting place of 3 of Mr. Best's cats, Floss, Fluff and Tip. Mr. Best also had a birdhouse or aviary. This was continued by the park, but was closed eventually in about 1949. This play area was open for children in 2010. Formerly, it was the site of a pitch and putt course. Mr. Best constructed 4 pools in his park. This was the top one and was encircled by a bank. It probably acted as a reservoir for a stream which flowed away into the bottom pool at the southern end of the park. It is a bit of a mystery as to where the water came from for this top pool, because we're at a very high point in the park. This piece of land behind me was once the site of a children's playground with swings and roundabouts. It was opened in 1932 and wasn't finally demolished until the year 2000, when the park had its makeover. This line of trees marks the western boundary of Mr. Best's private park. When it became a public park in 1922, the 9-acre field to the west-hand side of it became part of the park. Later on, it became part of Corngreaves Golf Course, and later still, part of Corngreaves Nature Reserve. Corngreaves Hall was built in the late 1700s, but by the 1830s, it was owned by the British Iron Company that used it as a residence for the works manager. It was here, in 1839, that Mr. Best was born, the son of Emmeline and Benjamin Best. In 2013, the work to convert Corngreaves Hall into 9 luxury apartments was completed. Although built in the late 18th century, it is believed that in the early 19th century, part of Corngreaves Hall was redesigned in a Gothic revival style, with castellated elevations and quatrefoil and lancet windows. In spite of what some people think, Haden Hill Park never reached the River Stour, but at a later date, part of Corngreaves Golf Course did. The 9-hole Corngreaves Golf Course was open to the public on Saturday the 27th of May 1972. Later it was converted into an 18-hole course, but because of underuse, the course was closed on the 1st of April 1999. Here we are looking at the fairway to the first hole. Between 2000 and 2002, there was a tree planting scheme, and the area of the former golf course was converted into a nature reserve. The bottom part of the 9-acre field was laid out for a football pitch for the 1953-54 season. The first club to play there were Cradley Heath Labour Club. From the top pool, or reservoir pool, a stream flowed southwards. Part of its course was lined with sandstone blocks, so forming small waterfalls. It then went into 2 more pools before finally debouching into the bottom pool, sometimes known as the boating pool. It is believed that there wasn't sufficient water in the reservoir pool to have a continuous flow. It is quite possible that there was a small sluice gate in the southern corner of it, and this was opened when Mr. Best had guests touring around the park. The bottom pond was by far the largest of the 4 which Mr. Best constructed. It required the building of a retaining dam. I am standing on the top of it at this moment. It was called the boating pool, and the boathouse was on the far side of it. Today its site is occupied by a pond-dipping platform, which was put in during the makeover. On the western side of the pool used to be 2 rustic bridges. One was demolished many years ago, but the other one was rebuilt during the makeover. It may seem absolutely amazing, but to my right here was a path which goes for about 80 yards and leads to Mr. Best's picnic house. It was a 2-storied building, and when it became a public park, some local men applied to the council to use it as a Sons of Rest. That was in 1932. Later, when the permanent Sons of Rest was built at the top end of the park in 1937, the old picnic house was demolished. To my right is a small circular building, which was a hermitage constructed by Mr. Best. It never had a hermit in it though. It has been rebuilt several times and is in a parlous state. This is one of the 2 rustic bridges which were here in Mr. Best's time. This is the one which was restored in the makeover of the park in 2000. To my left you find a culvert, and that culvert marks the point where the stream from the upper reservoir entered the bottom pool. This field here is sometimes referred to as the grass bowl. In the days of Mr. Best's private park, this field was used for haymaking. During the days of the public park, the western part of it was used as a football pitch. It was first used by Haden Rangers Football Club in 1949, who used the bandstand as a changing room. On the western side of the field were 2 ponds that acted like a magnet for the football. It was always necessary to keep a long fishing rod with a net on the end to retrieve the ball. Both of the ponds have been drained. The bandstand was sited about here. It was the gift of Joseph and Littleton Perry and was ready for use for the opening of the public park in 1922. It was well used, and by 1925 as many as 28 bands were booked to provide a summer programme. The most popular day was Sunday, but performances didn't begin until 8 o'clock in the evening so that people could go to church first. Due to vandalism, the bandstand was rebuilt in 1936, but sadly, due to the same problem and the advent of television, it was dismantled in 1967. Behind me is Haden Hill House and Hall, and to my right is the great grassy bowl. To the left were Mr. Best's formal herbaceous border. This, in fact, was the site of 2 cottages marked on the 1821 map on the very edge of Haysich Common. In the days of the public park, these were rose gardens, but in the more recent makeover, they've been converted back to herbaceous borders, as they would have been in Mr. Best's day. The most northerly of the cottages, shown on the 1821 map, is about here, more or less in the centre of the gardens. The park is used for many purposes, such as taking a stroll, dog walking, feeding the ducks, and having a picnic. Fitness enthusiasts may go for a jog and use the recently installed fitness stations. There are 2 playgrounds, one for toddlers and another one for older children. There are also 2 bowling greens and a multi-purpose court where board games can be played. Ornithologists will have a field day in the park and Corngreaves Nature Reserve. In 2013, 39 species of birds were identified. For many years, a firework display with a huge bonfire was held on the old bandstand field. Spectators were able to look down on the display from vantage points on the size of the bowl-shaped field. The last bonfire was held in 1990. Each year, a programme of events is organised by Sandwell Council. In recent years, Tudor, Civil War, Boer War and Homefront reenactment groups have performed in the park, and there are musical events ranging from brass bands to pop groups. At the end of November, the old hall is festooned with holly and ivy, and of course, Santa always makes a visit.